The Convergence had spent approximately 4 million years perfecting the art of adaptation, not the kind of adaptation where you build a house when it rains, mind you, but the respectable kind where you grow gills when your planet decides to become an ocean. They considered this the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement, which said something about their priorities or possibly their plumbing skills. Their philosophy permeated every aspect of galactic civilization worth discussing at dinner parties. When a sun expanded, species didn't flee, they developed heat-resistant cellular structures. When gravity increased, bones densified over generations. When atmospheric composition shifted, respiratory systems obligingly transformed. The universe was a series of problems to be solved through biological reformation, and the Convergence had written the textbook. Literally, it was required reading in 70% of known space, and doubled as an excellent cure for insomnia. The galaxy operated on this principle with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine, assuming the machine had evolved oil glands specifically for that purpose. Thousands of species joined the greater community after demonstrating their ability to reshape themselves according to environmental pressure. It was natural. It was elegant. It was the way things had always been done. Then there were humans, but we'll get to them. The planet in question held designation JK-447, which told you everything about how much the cartography department cared about it. Third rock from an unremarkable yellow star, moderate gravity, nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, the usual tedious specifications that made up 70% of terrestrial worlds. The only notable feature was an extensive cave system beneath the northern continent, which had attracted scientific interest the way shiny objects attract certain bird species. The research outpost had been established 6 months prior in one of the larger caverns. High ceilings, stable temperature, multiple passages for exploration. It checked all the boxes on the expedition approval form. The team consisted of 3 Convergence biologists studying extremophile bacteria, 2 methodical calculating mineral composition with the kind of obsessive precision that made other species uncomfortable, and 1 human engineer. Marcus Webb had not been part of the original crew manifest. He'd been a last-minute addition when the transport ship needed to balance cargo weight, and apparently humans counted as cargo if you filled out the right paperwork. The expedition leader had protested, citing concerns about including a species barely 3 generations into galactic membership, but budgets were budgets and Marcus came with his own tools. The human had spent most of 6 months being professionally ignored, which seemed to suit him fine. He maintained equipment, optimized power distribution, and occasionally asked questions that everyone else found either primitive or irrelevant. Where does water drain in these caves? What's the load-bearing capacity of these formations? Why is everything damp? The kind of concerns you'd expect from a species still figuring out faster than light travel. The seismic readings started 3 days before everything went sideways. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts in the planetary crust, the kind of geological hiccup that happened on tectonically active worlds. The methodical ran their calculations with characteristic thoroughness, producing probability matrices that predicted a 0.03% chance of significant environmental disruption. Acceptable parameters, announced Vex, the senior methodical, whose crystalline form refracted light in ways that gave everyone headaches during briefings. Adaptation protocols should be initiated as precautionary measure. The Convergence team nodded in that knowing way species do when they've got millions of years of genetic modification backing them up. Their bodies had already begun the preliminary changes. Throck, the expedition leader, was developing denser bone structure and enhanced lung capacity. His colleague Mivan was growing secondary eyelids and water-resistant skin membranes. Perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon activities. Marcus looked up from the power junction he was rewiring. What's the evacuation plan? The question landed in the cave like a foreign object. Throck's voice carried the tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. We adapt to environmental changes. We don't flee from them. Right? But if the caves flood, then we'll be prepared. Niven's skin was already taking on a faint blue tint, indicating the early stages of aquatic adaptation. Our bodies will adjust to aquatic conditions within 48 hours. The methodical are non-biological and unaffected by water. There's no cause for concern. What about me? You're human. Throck said it the way someone might say you're left-handed, an acknowledgement of a minor deviation from the norm. Surely your species has some adaptive capabilities. We get pruny fingers if we stay in the bath too long. The silence suggested this was not the answer anyone wanted to hear. Perhaps you should begin physiological preparations. Vex offered helpfully. Focus your genetic restructuring on respiratory adaptations, and we can't do that. Can't. 3 Convergence scientists and 2 methodical turned to stare, which was quite a lot of staring from quite a lot of different eye configurations. What do you mean, can't? Marcus set down his tools with the careful precision of someone buying time to phrase something diplomatically. Humans don't really change. Not fast, anyway. We're pretty much stuck with what we've got. He paused. But we're really good at changing other things. Nobody asked what he meant by that. In retrospect, someone probably should have. The rain started 36 hours later. Now, rain on JK 447 was not typically newsworthy. The planet had weather. Weather included precipitation. This was all very standard. What was less standard was the volume, intensity, and sheer bloody-minded determination of the water currently attempting to relocate the entire atmosphere to ground level. It hammered the surface with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for personal vendettas. Within 6 hours, the underground rivers that wound through the cave system had gone from gentle trickles to angry torrents. Within 12 hours, the lower passages were impassable. Within 18 hours, water was pooling in the main cavern where the outpost had been established, rising with the inexorable certainty of bad news. The Convergence team's adaptations were progressing well, which would have been more comforting if they'd been progressing faster. Throck had working gills, but they weren't quite working properly yet. Niven could hold her breath for an impressive 6 minutes, but still needed to breathe eventually. The third biologist, Kess, had gotten his adaptations slightly wrong, and now had webbed hands that made operating equipment difficult. The methodical weren't concerned about drowning, but they were discovering that water pressure and crystalline structures had some unforeseen interaction problems. Vex kept making concerning cracking noises whenever submerged. Marcus, meanwhile, was moving. He'd started when the water reached ankle depth, which the others had barely noticed. While they monitored their biological changes and recalculated probability matrices, the human had been dragging equipment crates to the edges of the cavern. Building something. Stacking things. What are you doing? Throck had asked, water now mid-shin and rising. Building a wall. A wall? Yeah. To keep the water back. Marcus didn't look up, busy positioning a heavy storage container across one of the smaller passage entrances where water was flowing in, or at least slow it down. That's not... Throck paused, trying to articulate exactly what was wrong with this approach. We don't block water. We adapt to it. I'm adapting. Marcus wedged another container in place. I'm just adapting the cave instead of myself. The philosophical implications of this statement went unexamined because the water level increased another 6 inches. By hour 20, everyone was starting to get nervous, Even the Convergence team, who'd been assured by their own biology that nervousness was premature. The water was knee-deep throughout most of the cavern and showed no signs of stopping. The rain above continued its percussive assault on the planet's surface, feeding the underground rivers with the kind of abundance that sounded generous until you were standing in it. Marcus had progressed from building simple barriers to constructing something that might generously be called a drainage system. He'd torn apart one of the survey drones, repurposed its propulsion system into a pump, and was using sections of equipment housing as channels to direct water flow toward a lower passage. "This is madness," Niven observed, though notably she was standing behind one of Marcus's barriers, where the water level was 3 inches lower. "You can't engineer your way out of a natural disaster. Watch me." Marcus was shoulder-deep in water, sealing gaps in his makeshift channel with emergency foam insulation. "Vex, I need you to calculate flow rates through Passage 7 versus Passage 12. Which one drops faster?" "I what? This isn't." The methodical's crystalline form flickered with what might have been confusion or possibly irritation. "Hard to tell. Passage 12 descends at a 7-degree angle over 40 meters. Perfect. We're redirecting water there. You cannot simply redirect a flood. Not with that attitude." The thing about Marcus's approach was that it shouldn't have worked. The Convergence had studied environmental challenges for millions of years, and the solution had always been biological adaptation. You didn't fight the environment. You became suited to it. This was established science, proven methodology, the foundation of galactic civilization. The thing about Marcus was that nobody had explained this to him properly, or possibly he'd explained it to himself differently. By hour 24, he'd constructed a series of channels that redirected roughly 40% of incoming water toward the lower passages. He'd built retaining walls from equipment crates, furniture, and at one point, an entire laboratory workstation that he'd dismantled with alarming speed. He'd created a pumping system from 3 different pieces of unrelated equipment that kept the main living area merely ankle-deep instead of waist-deep. The other team members had progressed from watching in horror to watching in fascination to actually helping, though they maintained running commentary about how this was all very irregular. "Hand me that support strut," Marcus called to Kess, who was discovering his webbed hands were actually useful for swimming over to fetch things. "This is not how civilized species handle environmental challenges," Kess said, handing over the strut. "How's your gill situation working out?" "They itch and I can only breathe underwater for 90 seconds. Then help me build this wall higher." The rain continued. The water rose. Marcus kept building. He'd identified the problem with mechanical clarity. Water was coming in faster than it was draining out. Biological adaptation took time. Nobody had, and sitting around waiting to grow gills was a plan that worked right up until you drowned before growing them. The solution was equally mechanical: redirect water, create barriers, and move everyone to higher ground while doing both. The higher ground in question was an elevated cave chamber Marcus had spotted during the initial survey, something he'd noted in his personal logs with the annotation "Good Emergency Shelter." The chamber sat 20 meters above the main cavern, accessed by a natural rock formation that was currently underwater but could be reached with the right approach. The right approach in this case involved Marcus constructing a rope guidance system, a series of rest platforms using equipment cases sealed with emergency patches, and what he called a safety line that everyone else called a piece of cable that will definitely break. "You want us to swim through flooded passages to reach an uncertain destination using improvised equipment," Throck said flatly. Water was chest deep now, and his gills were finally working properly, which made the whole situation feel more ironic than reassuring. I want us to not drown, Marcus corrected. The chamber's dry, defensible, and above the flood line. I've already moved supplies up there. When did you, while you were adapting? The migration happened in stages. Marcus went first, hauling waterproof containers of equipment and supplies through the flooded passages. The rope guidance system worked, not elegantly, but it worked, which was apparently the human standard for success. The platforms provided rest stops. The cable didn't break, though it made concerning noises. Kess went next, his partial aquatic adaptations actually helping. Then Mivan, who'd finally gotten her lung capacity where it needed to be. The methodical went third and fourth, their crystalline bodies managing the water pressure better now that they'd recalibrated their structural integrity. Throck went last, taking a final look at 6 months of research equipment, now submerged under 3 meters of water and rising. The upper chamber was everything Marcus had promised, which was to say it was dry, elevated, and had enough space for everyone to stand without touching. The bar was low, and everyone cleared it, but Marcus hadn't stopped at just getting them to higher ground. The human had been busy during his supply runs. The chamber now contained organized equipment staging areas, a makeshift air circulation system using a repurposed atmospheric processor, a water collection point that filtered runoff for drinking, and sleeping areas marked out with the kind of efficiency that suggested military training or possibly obsessive-compulsive disorder. You built a base, Vex observed, crystalline form, refracting the emergency lighting Marcus had strung up. In 3 hours you constructed a functional habitat. It's not fancy. It's not biologically integrated. Throck corrected, examining the water filtration setup. This is all mechanical, external, temporary. Yep, but it works. Yep. There was a long moment of silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of water still flooding the caves below. The rain had finally begun to ease, but the damage was done. The lower caverns would take weeks to drain naturally. Your species doesn't adapt to environments, Mivan said slowly, working through the implications. You adapt environments to yourselves. We prefer it that way. Marcus was checking supply inventory, marking items on a salvaged data pad. Easier to build a house than grow fur. Faster to dig a well than evolve a hump. But the time investment, the resources, the learning curve, already paid. We've been doing this for thousands of years. He glanced up. How long does it take your species to develop aquatic adaptations? 48 to 72 hours for basic functionality. I built a drainage system in 24. The methodical ran calculations, probability matrices factoring in new variables. The human approach requires tool use, material resources, energy expenditure, and assumes environmental modification is possible. Also assumes I'm not patient enough to wait 3 days for gills. What if the environment can't be modified? Kess asked. What if you're in a situation where building isn't an option? Marcus shrugged. Then we build the tools to leave and go somewhere we can build. This statement hung in the air with the weight of a philosophical bomb. The Convergence had spent millions of years adapting to what was. Humans had spent thousands of years changing what was into what they wanted. Neither approach was inherently better, but one of them had kept everyone dry during a flood. The rescue ship arrived 68 hours after the rain started. They found all team members alive, healthy and living in what the report would later describe as an improvised but surprisingly functional habitat constructed from salvaged equipment and sheer stubbornness. Marcus was explaining structural improvements to Throck when the rescue team leader arrived. Something about load-bearing calculations and drainage optimization. The Convergence biologist was taking notes. "We should implement these designs in future cave surveys," Throck was saying. "Redundant systems in case adaptation protocols are delayed. Or you could just pack sandbags." What are sandbags? The rescue team processed everyone through standard emergency protocols, medical scans, psychological evaluations, and the inevitable paperwork that followed any research disaster. Marcus passed everything except the psychological eval, which flagged him for inappropriate problem-solving approaches during crisis situations. He considered this a win. The Convergence filed their official report 3 weeks later. It contained extensive documentation of the flooding event, analysis of their adaptation protocols, and a lengthy section on alternative environmental response strategies observed in non-conforming species. There was a footnote about humans that suggested perhaps they should be restricted from environmental advisory positions until they learned to respect proper biological adaptation procedures. The recommendation was ignored by the review board, primarily because the review board had just received reports from 4 other disaster sites where humans had done similar things. Apparently, this was a pattern. Marcus got reassigned to a rapid response team specializing in emergency evacuations and disaster management. His official title was Environmental Adaptation Specialist, which was hilarious if you understood the irony. He spent the next year teaching other species how to build walls, dig channels, and construct shelter, spreading the apparently revolutionary concept that sometimes you change your surroundings instead of yourself. The Convergence never quite wrapped their heads around it. They'd file away the lessons learned, implement some of the technical improvements, and then go right back to growing gills when planets got wet. It was what they knew. It was what they were good at. It was what millions of years of evolution had prepared them for. But now, on every deep space expedition, alongside the biologists and geologists and xenoanthropologists, there was usually a human engineer. Just in case. Just in case the environment decided to change faster than biology could keep up. Just in case someone needed to build a wall, dig a channel, or construct a shelter on higher ground. In a galaxy where species had spent millions of years becoming perfect for their worlds, humans had spent thousands of years making worlds perfect for them. The Convergence called it stubborn, the methodical called it statistically improbable. Humans called it Tuesday. Nobody could decide if it was brilliance or insanity. The general consensus landed somewhere around both, and please don't let them near the environmental controls. But when the caves flooded, everyone knew who to call, not to grow gills. To build something that made gills unnecessary. That was the human way. It shouldn't have worked as well as it did, but the universe had stopped being surprised by what humans thought should work. They'd just learned to stand back and watch the show, preferably from higher ground that someone had helpfully engineered to be flood-resistant. The galaxy adapted, humans built, and somewhere in between, everyone survived.